It isn't, Gene. What is it? You can't hear me? Okay. I'm Dick Morse, member of the Lou Douglas Lecture Series Committee, and have been this opportunity to welcome all of you to this third lecture in the Lou Douglas Lecture on Public Affairs. The series was begun in honor of Lou Douglas, who is a very distinguished K-State professor of political science, and he was also a supporter of the University for Man, UFM, from its very beginnings. The series is sponsored by the University for Man, the Office of the Provost of the University, Student Governing Association, the Division of Continuing Education, the Department of Political Science, the Pre-Law Club, the Ecumenical Christian Ministries. It's also, if you'll notice in your folder, sponsored by a good many friends of the university. I will not begin to list those. After tonight's lecture, there will be a reception in the Key Room, which is upstairs in the Union, and it's being hosted this evening by the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication. I invite all of you to attend and have an opportunity of meeting our lecturer this evening. The next Lou Douglas lecture will be April 21st at 7, a little earlier, 7 o'clock, here in Forum Hall. The speaker will be Barbara Ehrenreich, who will speak on the disappearing middle class. Tomorrow night, our speaker for the evening will be at the library at a meeting co-sponsored by the Friends of the Library, and will be addressing, not as a speech, but more as a seminar and discussion of the impact of the consumer movement on advertising. Do want to call your attention to the fact that you may have seen it in the supermarkets and around town that UFM is taking donations of books, and there will be a book sale this Saturday from 10 to 5 at the UFM. Still need donations, and come swap a book. Before we get into the series, I do want to recognize Mary Douglas, widow of Lou Douglas. Mary? Ah, there we are. And then a special treat, 3 granddaughters, daughters of Steve Douglas that you basketball fans will remember. Also wish to introduce those who are on the stage, particularly Tammy McCrary, who represents the advertising club on campus. Tammy? The other gentleman beside our speaker is Harold Cordry. Many of us have never met Harold, and that's one of the reasons why we've asked him to introduce the speaker this evening. Harold is not a ghostwriter. He is actually a real writer. He's the editor, editorial page editor. I think they need to edit another edit in this editorial page editorial of the Manhattan Mercury. He's relatively new to town, and some of us, anyway, have appreciated his contribution to the improved editorial page of the Manhattan Mercury. He's an adjunct professor of journalism here at the university. He comes from the editorial staff of the Kansas City Star and has been a faculty member at the University of Missouri School of Journalism. We welcome you, Harold, and would like to ask you, if you would please, to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you very much. I am, I must say, only a humble and distant cousin journalistically of our speaker tonight, Mr. Stanley Cohen. But this relationship is nonetheless one which I hasten to acknowledge with considerable pride, because the contributions and high standards of a writer and editor such as Mr. Cohen inevitably enhance not only the general level of public esteem for our craft as a whole, but also the self-esteem of individual practitioners who labor in roles which seem superficially at least so diverse and, and disconnected. I'm very pleased, therefore, to be given the opportunity to acknowledge this debt and to play a small role in these doings. Many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with the general outline of Mr. Cohen's career from 1984 through part of 1987, I think. He served in London as editor of Focus, a monthly business magazine published by Crane Communications Incorporated for senior marketing executives in the European market. In this capacity, he was responsible for a news beat which encompassed advertising and marketing developments in 17 Western European countries, the common market, and the new international media, which are playing so important a role in developments there. Prior to taking on that assignment, which was decidedly a late career change in direction, Mr. Cohen spent more than 40 years with Crane Communications in Washington, originally as Washington editor of Advertising Age, and later as editor of its editorial page and manager of the 18-person Crane Washington News Bureau. His writings over the years reflect an abiding concern for fairness, honesty, responsibility, and reason, and for that special, though occasionally depreciated, subcategory of reason, common sense. His columns and editorials have been occasionally profound, always insightful, and at the same time remarkably entertaining, thanks in part to his unseen colleague, Senecus, who isn't going to be here tonight. Indeed, I imagine that those readers who underline the good parts as I do have frequently found themselves underlining almost everything in Mr. Cohen's writings. He's taken on all the most difficult issues of his time, notably those relating to consumer interests and regulatory matters, and made them intelligible to those who had neither the time nor the perspicacity to do so themselves. The writer, seen through his writings, is clearly a man who is deeply troubled by the impact of television advertising on children, by the shame of promoting cigarette consumption, by the excesses of market control by monopolistic forces, and by the prospects of environmental degradation and waste. He believes strongly that market decisions reflecting the selfish interests of consumers and vendors do not necessarily serve the public interest. And this is particularly so, he says, in a bottom-line economy in which business executives must spend so much of their time worrying about the stock market value of their company. His views may come as a shock to those who expect to hear the verse about free enterprise and free markets as the key to a better world, if only the government will get out of the way. But he's not a libertarian, not in this sense at least. He's a realist. But I'll let him explain to you what I mean by that. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to present Stanley Cohen.
Harold, thank you for that introduction. It's very generous, and it adds to all the pleasure I've already had being in Manhattan. You can imagine what it's like to get up after a nap in the afternoon and find the local paper with a picture of yourself large enough, I mean the kind of pictures that they run of Jesse Jackson or somebody like that. And I've already had today a meeting with some very promising students at the university. I had a press conference and it was interviewed by the radio. Had a very nice lunch. And tomorrow I'm going to meet with 3 other groups of students. And here we are with a fine, interested audience. And Nothing could make me happier than to be where I am tonight. From the primary campaigns in all parts of the country comes an unfamiliar message. Americans are puzzled. They don't like what's happening to our country. Our characteristic optimism gives way to anger and fear. The contest in both political parties features seasoned experts, yet you would have to go back to the days of the Great Depression to find a time when voters in such numbers responded to pie-in-the-sky candidates. Voters seek assurance that America is still secure in its role as the world leader. We took pride in the fact that sound as a dollar described a currency envied by all, that made in America was the mark of product excellence. It's a new experience to find that the dollar no longer towers over other currencies, that our shops are stocked with merchandise marked made in Korea. And that's the least of it. If the issue was only money and jobs, we might be reassured as the candidates tell us it's merely a matter of rolling up our sleeves. What hurts most are the changes in our communities. We don't recognize ourselves. We associate American life with solid human values, communities where people are confident about their family's future. We think of Americans as family-oriented, supporters of sound religious values, generous to each other, careful with money. And it's hard to reconcile these stereotypes with what we see around us: drugs, broken marriages, child and spouse abuse, our brightest and best young people rushing to the psychiatrist to find why, with all our gadgetry, life is empty. Against this background, there's a special urgency to this evening's topic, the marketplace as an arbiter of public policy. Because the marketplace has more to do with our plight than we have been willing to admit. It's an invisible force which affects our economic success or failure. But it is more. It also has a pervasive impact on moral and social values, and it's therefore a subject which ought to be on the 1988 political agenda. Public policy, of course, is presumed to encompass public interest, a subjective concept covering a vast array of activity. As shorthand for high-minded aspirations, the expression has special resonance. For many in the trenches in Washington, it raises goose pimples. Politicians, public interest advocates, the principled among the advocates of special interests, and members of the press, who tend to think of themselves as a particularly noble breed. It's like Yankee Doodle must have been to George Washington's men at Valley Forge. This evening, we examine the public interest solely in terms of people, of goods and services. While they are not the be-all and end-all of existence, they affect the quality of life. What are we looking for? If abundance was the sole consideration, we would have little to talk about. The bewildering choices in our shopping malls are reminders that our marketplace, whatever its faults, caters to our material needs. But public interest does not stop with abundance. It introduces quality tests. How satisfactory are the products? What social costs does the process impose? My definition of public interest calls for products and services which enhance our comfort and convenience, which are safe to use but do not pollute air and water or squander resources indispensable for the survival of ourselves and our posterity, and which support the principle that we are all God's creatures whose aspirations and individuality are to be nurtured and respected. And this evening we will look at the market system as it has emerged and continues to emerge, and we will consider whether such a system, left to its own ends, can be trusted to meet our public interest needs. According to the folklore, the marketplace has virtually divine attributes. It is economic democracy. As consumers spend their dollars, they vote for the products and services they want to elect. It is peopled by conscientious providers competing fiercely to provide the best quality at the lowest price. That's the folklore based on the economic model, a model which calls for unrestricted competition among vendors and for consumers who make rational and informed decisions. But first, how does our marketplace compare with the model? After all, if there are substantial deviations, should we expect the result which the textbook promises? Let's start by looking at the consumer, who is supposed to make informed, rational choices. Most consumers could hardly be described as well-informed. Often they don't care. At least they don't care enough to invest the time and effort required to get relevant information. And this is understandable. Much they buy involves technology they can't understand. Often the consumer doesn't even know what questions to ask. In any event, the products may be virtually interchangeable, except for packaging. Moreover, it's probable that the model which ranks highest in tests already has been replaced with a new model, or it isn't stocked by local stores. So consumers tend to stay with a brand that seems to do the job, or they may let the retailer be their purchasing agent and buy his generic brand. Sometimes they ask friends, or reach for a brand they recall hearing something about, unaware that it's no longer produced by the original supplier, or that the testimonial they recall is a jingle they absorbed from their car radio while commuting to work. How rational is the consumer? Consumers do not necessarily worry about social objectives or public interest as they reach for a product, but their economic ballot counts. They influence products and values when they reward automakers for producing souped-up gas guzzlers, reach for products in indestructible plastic containers, wash with non-biodegradable detergents, or line up to see movie thrillers laced with Rambo-type violence. So I think we can see that our consumer may not be the consumer visualized in the economic model, and his shortcomings are such that it's foolhardy to expect that he will exercise the disciplinary influence which the model requires. Now look at the vendors, who are supposed to be working their tails off to please consumers. Faceless is certainly an appropriate word in many of today's self-service retail establishments, managed by upwardly mobile young eager beavers who may well be the only person on the premises earning more than the minimum wage. Other help, mostly part-timers, know which brands the management is pushing, but that's about all the expertise they're expected to bring to their job. What about the suppliers? Of course, the brand managers and product group managers have an incentive to make sales, but they also march to other drums. Their personal goal is to get moved up or to find a better job elsewhere. probably with the competition. For someone who does not plan to stay on a job, cost-cutting shortcuts, special promotions, and other marketing gimmicks which may make more sense than worrying about repeat sales or developing better products for tomorrow. With this emphasis on short-term results bring a rebuff from the higher echelon? Thanks to a phenomenon not to be found in the economic model? Probably not. For the entrepreneur, the marketplace is a two-tier operation. On one level, he sells goods and services. On another, he sells equities in the company and maybe the company itself. It's an arrangement which puts a premium on short-term results. Brand managers are cherished for today's sales and profits, not for tomorrow's prospects. In any event, the product team may be several layers down in subsidiary operation, acquired along with a package of other formerly independent companies. Unless the team supplies good news, it may make sense to sell the division to some other conglomerate. Or it may even make more sense simply to shut it down and take a tax loss. Up there in the executive suite, secure in golden parachutes, senior management has its eyes on the main chance. What can we take over and who may be about to buy us? Could this be the vendor who is supposed to be pacing the floor, waiting for the consumer to cast his economic ballot? Providers who don't expect to be around when the consumer's ballots are counted? Top management with an agenda not necessarily related to consumer attitudes or even company welfare, finding its rewards less from pleasing consumers than pleasing the financial markets. A further complication, the financial market. In theory, they are the stabilizer, an incentive for management to behave in an efficient and responsible manner. In practice, the financial community has no such aspirations. Its sole interest is maximum return on investment. There's no room for sentimentality, such as long-term commitments to a company or its products. Brokers and money managers are on the phone describing greener pastures elsewhere. Loyalties are short-lived, and they seldom have anything to do with whether a company produces good products or behaves in a socially responsible manner. Obviously, there are still a vast number of retailers and suppliers who refuse to be seduced. People who have pride in their work do make a difference, whether it's on the production line or in the executive suite. This is, however, a powerful tide. We should be on guard, and we should respect those who swim against it. So far, we have looked at the difference between theory and reality with respect to the role players in the marketplace, the consumers and the vendors. There are other less crucial deviations between theory and reality yet to be considered. For example, how valid is the assumption that the marketplace, like the ballot, reflects majority will? Not true. And here we find insight into one of the major mysteries. Why does our marketplace produce so many junk products and so much junk culture? The explanation rests in something called market segmentation, a process which recognizes that the analogy between political and economic democracy begins and ends with the right to cast a ballot. Consider this difference. In the political marketplace, all rewards go to the winner, the candidate with the majority or the largest plurality. It pays to be a George Bush. There's not much profit in being Paul Simon. But in the economic marketplace, you win merely by making a good try. In such a rich market, you need only please a tiny segment. The Paul Simons of the marketplace world do very nicely. From this flows important consequences. If you have a product or a service which wins a respectable number of fans, you can ignore the rest and begin planning your retirement on the Riviera. The proven route to this utopian result is to segment, design products and sales pitches to suit identifiable demographic and economic populations. The result is all around us. Products pre-sold on television and skewed to the least discerning consumers, teenagers, for example, elbow their way onto store shelves, onto newsstands, and into the movie houses. Suppliers know that quality is not the test. The label, the package, or design gimmick makes the difference. A clever TV campaign can do wonders. Beers like Bud and Miller's, omnipresent on TV sports programs, wiped out hundreds of local breweries, certainly not on the basis of product quality. I've described the marketplace and some of the consequences. Entrepreneurs want numbers. Often they get them not by aiming for the whole market, but by targeting. Segmentation shapes our media, our popular culture, and ultimately our real-life values as distinguished from those we like to think we uphold. Nowhere is this more true than in television, where advertising rates vary with ratings. Few programs please anything near a majority of the potential audience. The goal is to attract the largest segment. Programs which under other circumstances would be viewed as having phenomenal reach in terms of the number of viewers perish simply because they are not first in their time slot. All tend to court the same large minority segment. Deadly sameness sets in. This phenomenon applies to news programs as well as entertainment. It is no accident that CBS used a producer from 60 Minutes to arrange the confrontation between George Bush and Dan Rather. Dan Rather's 7-figure salary would be short-lived if the ratings showed that he was losing market share. In TV journalism, the entrepreneurial instinct says, spice it up, make it exciting. Meanwhile, the advertiser plays his own game. He needs to sell only a small portion of that total audience. What if 90% of the viewers are bored or annoyed by his ad? 10% of 20 million viewers can mean a rich payoff. In any event, his goal may not be sales. When an obscure computer manufacturer pays $500,000 for a 15-second segment on the Super Bowl, is he selling computers, or is this his way of getting out the word that you may want to buy stock in his company? As they impact media, market incentives produce mixed results. In television, commercial clutter within and around programs keeps increasing. Only by becoming more entertaining can ads hope to be remembered. So the ads are often more creative than the programs. The rivalry for ratings avoids programs that stir the brain cells. TV does have its big moments, but each is a gutsy gamble by executives who have a lot to lose. By contrast, in at least one respect, the pursuit of numbers has what many regard as a constructive impact on news media, print news media. Because advertisers are more interested in numbers than in political orthodoxy, newspapers know it is in their economic interest not to slant news. That's a radical departure from the way news was written in the past, when publishers aspired only to serve readers who saw events through the same political prism. Abroad, including the UK and Western Europe, newspaper ownership is still seen first as a way to political influence. and news is routinely molded to conform to political dogma. Publishers say, if you don't like the way we slant the news, buy a newspaper which slants it your way. But balanced writing is not the only print media characteristic flowing from the competition for the consumer's ballot. As newspapers and magazines reach out for more readers, pop culture overflows beyond the cultists to the mainstream. It permeates TV programs, movies, music. It influences the way we dress, our vocabularies, and how we treat each other. It achieves respectability and legitimacy. Old values erode and new ones take over without benefit of clergy. So it's a less than perfect world. And these failings extract a high cost. What I have described is a marketplace which deviates from the textbook in crucial respects, and all too often produces results which are 180 degrees from what the model promises. To an alarming degree, it rewards junk instead of quality and channels capital and creative energy from the significant to the trivial. A little of this is tolerable, but the results can be cumulative. A nation which once dazzled the world with important products like sewing machines, the automobile, the radio, and the electric refrigerator is best known in this generation as the inventor of fast food restaurants and the source of endless ways of marketing aspirin, Vaseline, and new varieties of puffed rice. As Jesse Jackson tellingly reminds us, at a time when millions of VCRs are being sold to American consumers, not one VCR is made in America by an American company. For those who prefer to be philosophical, it may be reassuring to know that the market process can be self-correcting if you live long enough and are willing to absorb the cost. We see this now in beer. Entrepreneurial types find that millions of consumers really don't like Bud and Miller. So they reach out for imports and they generate new local brands, boutique beers. But what a cost. Consumers pay premium prices for beers that formerly were everyday staples. Having wiped out hundreds of established companies and jobs, the beer industry tries to rebuild. Now let us turn to remedies. Free market economists expect us to assume that some of the things I described, that none of the things I describe are happening. For them, tinkering with the marketplace is akin to tinkering with the Constitution. And they forget that even the Constitution is changed when we find need for improvement. Actually, our Constitution stands for something considerably short of pure political democracy. So if anything, history is on the side of those who warn that public policy cannot be left to a marketplace which relies on economic democracy. Alarmed by what they regarded as the abuses of the contemporary state legislatures, our founding fathers designed a government where the franchise was limited to male property owners, and the president and the Senate were selected by an elite few. Even today, we vest our franchise in elected members of Congress who may or may not reflect our will on many issues. The Founding Fathers were not required to think about economic democracy, a concept which was still decades away. But the lesson is there. If voters could not be trusted to put public interest ahead of the self-interest at the ballot box, why expect that they will put public interest ahead of self-interest in selecting goods and services? If we admit need to restrict political democracy, why shrink from facing up to the shortcomings of economic democracy? We struggle to make political democracy work because with all its faults, it's far better than any known alternative. The same can be said for economic democracy. The system has so much going for it, we could not contemplate a major change. And yet we cannot escape the reality. Our marketplace evolves further from the model. In our increasingly affluent society, impulse buying is more widespread than ever. On the supplier side, we have huge conglomerate bureaucracies with their own agenda independent of what's good for the public interest. We try to ease the pain. We fantasize about programs for consumer education. And we tinker. We set safety standards, pollution standards, and we reserve the right to punish businessmen for using unfair and deceptive advertising. Today, these interventions are dressed up with names like consumerism, environmental protection, and the like. But they have been part of our system for well over a century. First, in the late 19th century, with the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission to deal with railroad safety and to monopolistic pricing policies raised by the railroad barons, and certainly residents of Kansas know what I mean by that. In that same era, Congress also passed our first truth in advertising law, a postal fraud statute, which assured that farmers on the frontiers could buy from mail-order houses in Chicago with assurance that they would get what they ordered. And here again, it was the farmers in Kansas who Congress had in mind when they passed that postal fraud law. Beginning with the turn of this century, we've had a series of laws imposing stringent standards on food and drug safety. The most pervasive was 30 years ago, after pharmaceutical companies discovered they could expand profits and run up stock prices by introducing streams of products which in many cases were neither new nor effective. To dampen that dubious exercise of entrepreneurial initiative, Congress crafted a law which keeps drugs off the market until the vendor proves they are both safe and effective. So our history is replete with successes where we retained the fruit of free enterprise without choking on the seeds. Some of the major examples have been in communication. Locally regulated monopoly telephone companies and one federally regulated national interstate carrier. It produced the world's best phone service and one of the world's highest quality communications research organizations, AT&T. For radio and television, we developed a system of licensing which required stations to serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. If the result did not always achieve what we wished, it at least represented a strong countervailing pressure on managements which have powerful incentives to pursue the common denominator. In aviation, we allocated routes among carriers, weaving the smaller communities into the national fabric by requiring them to serve unprofitable as well as profitable markets. Some may contend it kept prices unreasonably high on heavily traveled routes, but it built a nationwide grid suitable to a people who value the opportunity to go anywhere and to have quality service when and if they need it. We know the regulatory process has its own built-in hazards. It can be litigious, time-consuming, nitpicking, but in a major respect, it's in the mainstream of American values, ground rules for a marketplace which otherwise leaves decisions impacting our well-being to individuals who are not responsible for public interest. There are numerous examples, but perhaps the most dramatic involves our automobile industry. The automobile industry is highly concentrated. huge companies, so huge that the president of one of them is remembered for asserting what's good for General Motors is good for America. Well, we've learned that what's good for General Motors is not necessarily good for America. GM built and marketed cars with known design faults, with smog-generating, gas-guzzling engines. When these practices were questioned, its response was to use its immense legal and political resources to resist every proposal for regulations related to safety, fuel efficiency, and protection of the environment. Fortunately, deregulation had yet to become a buzzword. So good sense prevailed, and we have in place today regulations which result in safer cars with cleaner and more efficient engines. And GM is no worse off for it. As they resisted safety, environment, and fuel efficiency standards, the Detroit power centers pursued another policy which has proven costly to our society. Their decision to leave to the Japanese the market for small, fuel-efficient, modestly priced cars. In retrospect, our automobile industry's resistance to safe cars and smaller cars was unbelievably short-sighted. Yet it responds to the logic which we have discussed regarding the dynamics of the marketplace this evening. By conventional Detroit wisdom, profits rested on irrational features like high tail fins. The consumer segment interested in such features might be only a sliver of the total market, but it was enough to pay big dividends and make heroes out of the executives who plotted this course. From Detroit's vantage point, safety and environmental protection features merely meant higher sticker prices with no added sales appeal. The Japanese were not inhibited by such hang-ups, and while Detroit pursued its sliver markets, they established primacy in a market that previously was all American. A second example of regulation as a safeguard against marketplace pressure relates to television. Earlier, I described the marketplace influence on the TV programming process. Our answer to that was a regulatory system which required stations to serve the public interest, a requirement grounded on the fact that TV stations use frequencies granted to them under federal license. The impact of that system has been particularly evident in broadcast journalism. Balance and fairness became broadcast journalism's hallmark, not because it may or may not serve the economic interest of broadcasters, but because there has been a remedy with teeth in it. If you felt a broadcaster stacked the deck on public issues, you could bring your complaint to the Federal Communications Commission. Now the Reagan administration has virtually scrapped the broadcast regulatory system. It has accepted whole hog the industry's contention that the government's review of programming, particularly where news and opinion is involved, raises free speech issues, that the large number of stations will in itself assure a variety of opinion. Performance requirements, including the fairness requirement for news and public affairs, have been dismantled. Broadcast management's decisions are now shaped almost solely by market forces. This is happening at a time when the ownership of stations and networks is passing from managements which had been broadcast-oriented to investment groups which see television as just another profit center. The dismantling of the TV oversight system raises questions of good faith. Each grant to one applicant is a denial to one or more others. Stations are worth millions of dollars even before they are built. No wonder each applicant willingly pledges to serve the public interest better than any of the rivals. In their zeal to win, applicants promise to be particularly diligent about programs for children, to make a conscious effort to discuss fairly issues of importance to the community, to be fair in presenting news and opinion. Can you imagine anyone getting a license if he said he intended to use the station to advance his own political theories? But if the licensing agency is not going to hold the licensees to these commitments with meaningful supervision, what is this licensing process about? Aside from impact on the public, is it fair to the losing applicants if the winners are allowed to escape their commitments? Our experience with airlines and telephones provides other examples which illustrate the potential and the hazards when we use regulatory procedures to channel the energies of the innovative process. Deregulation of airlines has brought reduced fare opportunities on heavily traveled routes, but it has also meant complicated fare schedules and higher fares on less traveled routes. Are we better off? Certainly, we created a good market for second-hand aircraft, airline stocks, and semi-pro pilots, but it's hard to run an airline with one eye on the Dow Jones. Since the airline's survival depends on the bottom line, the system has an incentive to cut corners on maintenance. The passenger survival is left to the good faith of airline maintenance people and a thin line of FAA inspectors who have to second-guess them. By contrast, our experience with the telephone system tells us that a regulatory system which works in one era may not work in another. Given the technological developments, an interstate carrier monopoly no longer made sense. But deregulation of the interstate phone service created its own problems. In the new half-free, half-slave economy, big users persuaded the regulators to shift costs from the interstate to the unregulated interstate system to the regulated local services. For many household users, the increased price of local phone service more than exceeds the saving from competition at the interstate level. In summary, and in conclusion, wisdom begins with realizing that the free market is a utopian concept. No imperative determines that the sum of self-interest decisions adds up to public interest. Our history is replete with examples where public and citizen action shaped the marketplace to our ends. We have demonstrated it is not necessary to tolerate harmful products simply because suppliers find they're readily and profitably sold, nor is it unreasonable for society to ensure that its TV licensees provide children with cultural experiences that will help them mature as thinking citizens. It's no more logical for us to rely on an unregulated marketplace than for our ancestors to look to assorted graven images for protection from the elements. We are ill-served by defeatists who say that the marketplace forces are beyond our control. No course could be more destructive to our well-being and our values. I speak against despair. As rational human beings, we can control our own economic destiny. In 1988, we have an opportunity to look for leaders who will show the way. Thank you.
you want to take that? Yeah. Thank you very much, Stan. Libertarian, he is not. Realist, he is. Now I think you understand why that phrase. He has agreed to answer questions, and which we'll take for a few minutes before we go to the key room for reception. I'm sure he stirred your thoughts about a good many matters.
Do we see some hands? Answer all your questions in text? Yes.
You say that increased regulation is the way to make our products safe and serve the public interest. But in your examples, you cite just a few oligopolistically controlled industries, the airline industry, the communications industry. How do you propose to regulate the small producer who produces maybe toys that are unsafe for our children without an enormous snowballing of our government, which is already in financial stress?
All right, let's take this in pieces. In the first place, we have in existence a Consumer Product Safety Commission, which has a very strong legislative mandate, but at the present time is operated by people who don't believe in the law and don't use it. So the remedy there is to put people in office who will enforce the law. The second part of your question has to do with the cost. I would feel much more comfortable about it if you said to me, how can we afford to spend all this money on a Star Wars research program when nobody knows what it's going to do or where it's going to go? I mean, with one little corner of the amount of money that's wasted by the Pentagon every year on weapon systems that won't work, and which nobody asks any questions about, we could deal with every conceivable consumer product problem. See if hand.
There we are.
Yes.
I'm a bit dubious about your comments on print journalism. It seems as though perhaps we're unaware that print journalism is for one party or the other because there isn't a significant difference.
Did everybody
For
hear the
example,
question?
particularly in the way they deal with foreign policy. It seems that having to do with both the Middle East and Latin America, newspapers generally have the same lines regardless of the editorial and policy of the
As a professional journalist, I guess my response to that would be that you're talking about the incompetence of journalists rather than the corruption of the system. What I was referring to is that before we had advertising, we had in this country something known as the party press. And every major city had several newspapers each specializing in the need of some particular political philosophy. And all the news in each of those newspapers was written to support that. And it was when department store advertising actually was the beginning of it, first became available, that the publishers decided that there was a heck of a lot more fun in having a newspaper serving everybody and getting all this money than there was in struggling to keep a political newspaper going. My interest in this subject goes back to, well, prehistorically to when I was doing my master's work at Columbia Journalism School. And I was researching the party press in the United States and took a lot of notes on how news was written in those days. And I remember quite clearly the coverage of a political campaign around 1880. And the lead had to do with the candidate, the Democratic candidate, I think it was Bryan. And anyway, the lead was something like William Jennings Bryan appeared at the Mark Twain tap room in Elmira, New York last night. His face was sallow, his voice was broken, he had trouble standing up, and he repeated the same banalities he's been saying every place else. And from there on, the reporter started to describe the scene. But essentially, that was the spirit in which this reporter was covering the campaign for a newspaper which was opposed to this candidate. And it was perfectly legitimate to write news that way in those days. Do we have another question here?
Here, green shirt.
Yes.
I have a question about the FDA. You said that you have an administration which assures that drugs are safe and effective. And this was brought out particularly, I think, by the thalidomide disaster when bad drugs were in the marketplace. Well, with the FDA, and the way I see it, we have the FDA can essentially make two flaws. It can pass a bad drug, or it can fail to pass a good drug. And there are a good body of evidence from various medical people I know who say there are many, many good drugs that have been created, but that are not passed by the FDA. And the idea I get from them is that this failure of improving our life by having better drugs has been masked by the FDA, whereas before we simply had bad drugs, and that was considered pretty bad. So there is a problem that seems to have been masked by the FDA and a cost by that administration that no one seems to know about.
Did everybody hear the
That
question?
might outright override the benefits.
The question is whether we've overcorrected in the drug field. Formerly, the drug companies were marketing questionable drugs, and then we gave the FDA a lot of power, and they may be suppressing good drugs and being too cautious. And the answer to that is not going to be a clear yes or no. In these areas, there is no absolute truth. You can make a mistake and put a drug on the market which you shouldn't put on the market, or you can keep a drug off the market too long. You have to say whose motive is pure. Certainly the drug company has a stronger motive to put on the market a drug which may not have been fully proven than the FDA has to keep it off. If the FDA errs, it would be overcaution. It might be bureaucratic overcaution, but it would be overcaution. Now, I've heard these arguments frequently in the case of many drugs over the years. I've also heard about all these remarkable drugs that are available abroad that aren't available here. I'm going to tell you that I was in the UK for 2.5 years. I had the occasion to do some doctoring, and I didn't find that they were any further ahead for us than we are on any of these important diseases that people were worried about. Now, there are some diseases where very experimental drugs in rare diseases are being used by an occasional investigator here who thinks that he is being held back. And it may be true in some cases. But I think I would conclude on the basis of hearing this argument over the years and never seeing these drugs ever come up eventually, that the claim that the FDA is overcautious might be an overstated claim. It might in some times, occasionally, be a little bit overcautious. But after all, they don't have any motive for being overcautious. And they are watched very closely by the entire medical profession as well as by the interested political people. They can't afford to be very wrong. So I think I would say they could be wrong, but they probably are not as wrong as their critics say they are. Does that help? Okay. Well, I don't think you can do more than help a little, because it's like drugs. They don't have a perfect cure. This is your last chance to get questions from me.
Gentleman on the aisle.
I guess my question would be somewhat similar to Sarah's. Are you saying that the print medium is more objective than say, the television medium?
No, I didn't say that. I said that that actually the television is more fair than print.
Oh, okay.
And that the reason that television's been more fair than print is it had to be. If a newspaper misuses you, and I'm sure that wouldn't be true of the Manhattan Courier, but there are newspapers which...
Manhattan Mercury.
We're-
The front page of the Manhattan Mercury.
Right. That if they abuse, if a newspaper abuses you, you can write them a letter and you can hope they'll correct it or give you a chance to be heard, but they may not. But if a radio or television station abuses you and you don't get satisfaction, in the past you could get satisfaction by contacting the Federal Communications Commission. So the tradition in broadcast journalism has been to be fair. And I'm not aware that broadcast journalists objected to it. The objections came mainly from management and from lawyers. And the issue was made about free speech, that this inhibits the broadcast journalists. Well, there's 50 years of experience as to whether this power was abused, and I am not aware of cases where broadcasters went to the federal courts and said, get those people off our back, they're trying to tell us what to broadcast. I am aware that broadcast journalism has been a quality operation in terms of fairness. And I think that the review of fairness was always after the event, not before the event, so there was no censorship as such. And the review was always in terms of the pattern of operation, not one specific example. So it seemed to me there was a lot of protection there for broadcasters, and they really were able to live with it. I'd be glad to hear another point of view on that if there's one in the audience.
Yeah, I have one that, in answer to that, of the roughly 15 or 18,000 applications, the FCC has only refused 20 to television stations. The classic case being in Jacksonville, Mississippi, I believe, where about the blacks went after. My point is, if you write to the FCC, they don't do anything about it, you just write to them. They don't withhold a license because the television station doesn't do its job.
Well, what you're saying is that they haven't been a raging bull in enforcing these things.
Well, I think 20 out
But-
of 16,000.
But there have been enough cases so that the general tenure of the industry has been fairly responsible. The Jackson, Mississippi case was a historic case. It was the pattern in the South in those days. And the federal government, in all aspects of its operations, tended to respect the peculiar things that went on in the South and not to question them too much. But it also became one of the turning points when finally the Jackson case was raised. It did help to contribute to the whole change in civil rights enforcement. Everybody satisfied? Do you all agree with me completely now? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're welcome to attend the Key Room for a reception and have a chance to talk personally with Stan Cohen. You're also invited to come to the seminar at the Federal Library on the Consumer Movement and Advertising tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock. And take your books to the UFM and attend the sale. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to your attendance at the next 4th Lou Douglas lecture.